The scream that tore through the quiet suburban hallway wasn't just a sound. It was the sound of a soul breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. I can still hear it ringing in my ears, sharp and desperate. Elena, a woman who had spent decades maintaining an image of perfect elegance, collapsed right there in the open doorway of her apartment. Her knees hit the hardwood floor with a sickening thud that made the delivery boy jump back in pure terror. The box of flowers had fallen from her manicured hands, spilling its contents across the welcome mat. They weren't the usual soft pinks or innocent whites she had been receiving for months. No, my dears, these were black. Deep, unnatural black roses that looked like they had been grown in the shadows of a grave. She was gasping for air, clutching her chest as if her heart had simply decided to stop beating. Her other hand, shaking violently, held the small cream-colored card that had come with the bouquet. She read it again, her eyes wide with a horror that went beyond grief. The ink was simple, the message devastating. It read, "He never loved you. I know because I read your diary for 20 years. Elena let out a wail that sounded like a wounded animal, curling into a ball on the floor, surrounded by those dark, ominous flowers that mocked her sorrow. The neighbors were opening their doors, peeking out, whispering, but she didn't care. The truth had finally arrived, and it was colder than death itself. But wait, I am getting ahead of myself, aren't I? It is easy to get lost in the climax, in the loud crash of the thunder, and forget the slow gathering of the clouds. How did we get to this moment of absolute destruction? How does a 69-year-old widow end up sending such a cruel final gift? Let me take your hand and lead you back. Let me tell you the story from the beginning, before the scream, back to the silence of a house that felt too big for just one person. It started on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 months prior, though the seeds were planted decades ago. The rain was tapping against the kitchen window of Clara's house, a rhythmic, lonely sound that matched the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Clara sat at her kitchen table, wrapping her hands around a mug of tea that had gone lukewarm. She was 69 years old, a woman with silver hair pulled back in a sensible bun and eyes that had seen too much but said very little. She wore a thick wool cardigan because the house always felt cold now that Arthur was gone. Arthur. The name still tasted like ash in her mouth. He had been dead for 7 months, buried in his best navy suit, eulogized as a loving husband and a pillar of the community. Clara had stood by the grave, dry-eyed, while people patted her shoulder and whispered about her strength. They didn't know it wasn't strength. It was numbness. It was the freezing paralysis of a woman who knows her entire life was a performance she hadn't agreed to star in. On the table in front of her, pushing aside the cold toast she hadn't touched, was a leather-bound book. The cover was worn, cracked at the spine, smelling of old perfume, a heavy, musky scent that certainly wasn't Clara's lavender water. It was the diary, Elena's diary. Clara ran her thumb over the cover. Her arthritis was acting up in the damp weather, making her joints ache, but she opened the book to a marked page anyway. She knew the words by heart. She didn't need to read them, but she did. It was a ritual. Entry dated October 14th, 2003. Arthur promised me he would leave her by Christmas. He said she is cold, that she doesn't understand him like I do. He brought me emerald earrings today. He says they match my eyes. Clara looked up from the page, staring at the empty chair across the table where Arthur used to sit, reading his newspaper, ignoring her. She remembered that Christmas of 2003. Arthur hadn't left. He had bought Clara a vacuum cleaner and complained about the turkey being too dry. He hadn't seemed like a man in love with anyone, really. For just a man who wanted his shirts ironed and his dinner hot. For 20 years, Arthur had been stealing these diaries. Or perhaps Elena gave them to him? It didn't matter. Clara had found the box in the attic a week after the funeral, hidden behind the winter coats. A box full of another woman's soul, another woman's delusions. And Arthur had kept them like trophies, or perhaps like insurance. Clara closed the book with a snap. The anger wasn't a fire anymore. It was a cold, hard stone in her gut. She reached for the telephone on the wall. The rotary dial made a soft whirring sound as she spun the numbers. She knew the number by heart now. "Hello, Robert's florist," a cheerful young woman answered. "Hello, dear. It's Mrs. Clara," Clara said, her voice steady, sounding every bit the sweet grandmother the world thought she was. "Oh, hello, Mrs. Clara. The usual order for today? The white lilies?" Clara paused. For 6 months, she had sent white lilies to Elena's address. Anonymous. No note. Just silence and flowers. It was psychological warfare, though the florist girl just thought it was a secret admirer. Elena must have been going mad, wondering who sent them. Was it Arthur from beyond the grave? Was it a guilt offering? "No, dear," Clara said, and her voice dropped an octave, becoming hushed and serious. "Not today. Today is the end of the cycle. I need something different." "Of course. What were you thinking?" "I want roses," Clara said, looking out at the gray rain, "but not red. I need them dyed black as night. Can you do that?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. The girl sounded hesitant. "Black roses? Mrs. Clara, that's usually for, well, it's very somber. Are you sure?" "I am quite sure," Clara replied, tightening her grip on the phone cord. "And I need a card. I need you to write exactly what I say. Do not change a word." She dictated the message slowly, enunciating every syllable. "He never loved you." She could hear the girl's breath hitch on the other side. The air in the kitchen felt heavy, charged with the electricity of a storm about to break. Clara felt a strange mixture of nausea and liberation. I have that written down," the girl whispered, clearly disturbed. "Is there a signature?" "No signature," Clara said. "Just send them. Same address. Immediately." She hung up the phone and sat back in the silence. The house creaked. The smell of the old diary's perfume wafted up again, sickeningly sweet. Clara looked at her hands. They were wrinkled, spotted with age, shaking slightly. These were the hands that had washed Arthur's clothes, cooked his meals, smoothed his brow when he was sick. These were the hands that had held his while he died, even knowing what she knew. She stood up slowly, her knees popping, and walked to the window. She watched a drop of rain race down the glass, distorted and heavy. She imagined Elena receiving the white lilies all these months, the hope that must have flared in the other woman's chest. Maybe she thought Arthur had left a provision in his will. Maybe she thought it was love reaching out from the afterlife. Clara let out a short, dry laugh that echoed in the empty kitchen. Oh, the cruelty of hope. She had lived on crumbs of hope for 40 years, hoping Arthur would look at her with warmth, hoping he would appreciate her. Now it was her turn to control the supply. She walked over to the trash bin. She picked up the diary from the table. For a moment, she hesitated. It was her only link to the truth, the only proof that she wasn't crazy, that her intuition had been right all along. But she didn't need it anymore. She had memorized the pain. It was part of her DNA now. She didn't throw it away, not yet. She sat back down and opened it to the very last entry, written just before Arthur got sick. He didn't come today. He says his wife is suspicious. I hate her. I hate her for existing. She is just a shadow in his house. A shadow, Clara whispered to the empty room. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and angry. She wasn't a shadow. She was flesh and blood. She was the one who had cleaned up his vomit when the cancer took him. She was the one who paid the bills. She was the reality. Elena was the fantasy. And today, Clara thought, smoothing her skirt, today the fantasy dies. She checked the clock. It was nearing noon. The delivery van would be arriving at Elena's apartment complex across town any minute now. Clara closed her eyes and leaned her head back against the chair. She tried to imagine the layout of Elena's hallway, a place she had never visited but had seen in her nightmares 1,000 times. She imagined the doorbell ringing. She imagined Elena putting on lipstick before answering, just in case. The phone rang, startling her. Clara stared at it. It wouldn't be the florist. It wouldn't be Elena. Elena didn't know who she was, not really. Clara let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound was shrill, demanding attention in the quiet house. She didn't answer. She just sat there, waiting, feeling the weight of 20 years of silence finally shifting, rolling off her shoulders like a heavy winter coat. The black roses were on their way. The message was on its way. It wasn't revenge, she told herself, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. It was a correction, a balancing of the scales. Arthur was gone. He had escaped the judgment. He had escaped the screaming and the crying. So it was just the 2 of them left now, the wife and the mistress, the reality and the fantasy. Clara took a sip of her cold tea. It was bitter. She swallowed it down. The clock struck 12. Somewhere across the city, a doorbell was about to ring. The receiver clicked back into its cradle, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, suffocating, like a wool blanket soaked in water. I sat there, my hands trembling, not from the cold, though the kitchen was freezing, as it always was since Arthur passed, but from the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what I had just done. The clock on the wall hummed, a low, electric buzz that seemed to vibrate right through my teeth. 60 seconds, a minute closer to the destruction of another woman's life. I looked down at the diary again. It was open to page 142. The spine cracked audibly as I flattened it against the Formica table. The handwriting was looped and frantic, the ink slightly smeared as if written in a hurry, or perhaps in tears. I needed to read it again. I needed to remind myself why I had ordered those black roses, why I had instructed that poor girl at the flower shop to write those cruel words. I wasn't a monster, you see. I was just a woman who had been erasing herself for 40 years so a man could shine. And now, looking at this leather-bound book, I realized he hadn't just been erasing me. He had been erasing her, too. October 22nd, 2005. The entry stared up at me. Arthur came over late last night. He was crying. He told me that Clara doesn't understand the poetry of life. He gave me a ring, a beautiful, heavy gold band with a ruby in the center. He told me it was his great-aunt Martha's, the one who lived in Paris. He said he couldn't bear for it to sit in a dark box in that house with a woman who doesn't love him. He put it on my finger and promised that one day we would go to Paris together, just like Martha. I feel like a queen. I read the words, and a bitter, dry laugh clawed its way up my throat. It scraped against my chest, hurting more than a sob. Great Aunt Martha, the poetry of life. Pushing the chair back, the metal legs screeching against the linoleum, I stood up. My hip gave a sharp twinge of protest, a reminder that I was 69 years old and my body was failing, but I ignored it. I walked out of the kitchen, past the hallway mirror that reflected a gray, tired woman in a beige cardigan, and climbed the stairs. Every step was a labor. The house smelled of dust and lemon polish, the scent of a life maintained perfectly on the surface while rotting underneath. I entered our bedroom, the master bedroom. The bed was made with military precision, just the way Arthur liked it, even though he hadn't slept in it for 7 months. I walked to the heavy oak dresser, the one he had bought at an auction in '98, claiming it was an antique investment. I opened the top drawer. There, nestled among my sensible cotton handkerchiefs and the lavender sachets meant to keep moths away, was a small velvet box. The velvet was worn bald in the corners. I opened it. Inside sat a heavy gold ring with a ruby in the center. It wasn't Great Aunt Martha's ring. Arthur didn't have a Great Aunt Martha in Paris. His aunt lived in Ohio and raised chickens. This ring was something we had bought together at a pawn shop in the city during a weekend trip in 1974, a frivolous purchase when we were young and still thought we might be happy. I had stopped wearing it because the setting snagged on my sweaters. I looked at the ring in my hand, then thought of the entry in the diary. October 2005. Arthur hadn't given Alina an heirloom. He had bought her a duplicate, a cheap copy. Or perhaps he had found something similar in a catalog and spun her a fairy tale about Paris and poetry. He had looked into her eyes, held her hand, and lied with the same effortless grace he used to tell me he was working late. The cruelty of it took my breath away. It wasn't just that he cheated on me. It was that he cheapened everything. He recycled his lies. He used the same scripts. He had made Elena feel special by giving her a story that didn't exist, grounded in a ring that was likely made of brass and glass, while the real gold sat in my drawer, unworn and unloved. "He never loved you," I whispered to the empty room. I closed my fist around the real ring, the metal biting into my palm. The anger that flared in my chest wasn't hot anymore. It was cold, calculating, and devastatingly clear. For 20 years, I had wondered if he loved her more, if she was the passion and I was the duty, if she was the color and I was the gray background. But reading that diary, seeing the dates, matching his lies to my reality, it became obvious. He didn't love either of us. He loved the reflection of himself he saw in our eyes. He loved me because I kept his shirts crisp and his dinner warm. He loved her because she looked at him like he was a tragic, romantic hero misunderstood by the world. We were just mirrors, placed at different angles to capture his good side. I walked back downstairs, gripping the banister tight. The house felt too big, too silent. I went back to the kitchen and sat down before the open diary. I turned the page, needing to see more, needing to stoke the fire before the phone rang again. February 14th, 2010, Valentine's Day. I waited for him until midnight. I made the coq au vin he likes. I wore the red dress. He called at 11:30. He whispered that Clara had fallen down the stairs and he had to take her to the emergency room. Poor woman. Even though she traps him, I feel sorry for her. He is so noble to stay by her side. I ate the dinner alone. My hands shook as I smoothed the page. February 14th, 2010. I remembered that night vividly. I hadn't fallen down the stairs. We had been watching a documentary about the Civil War. Arthur had fallen asleep in his armchair with his mouth open, snoring loudly. a line of drool running down his chin. He hadn't gone to the emergency room. He hadn't been noble. He had simply been too lazy to drive across town to see her, so he invented a tragedy involving me to keep her on the hook. He made me a victim to make himself a saint, I hissed, slamming my hand on the table. The teacup rattled in its saucer. He had painted me as a clumsy, fragile burden to this other woman, soliciting her pity while he slept comfortably in front of the television. And she believed him. She sat there in her red dress, eating cold chicken, admiring his sacrifice, while I sat here listening to him snore, wondering why my husband never bought me flowers anymore. The injustice of it burned my throat like acid. We had both been waiting for a man who didn't exist. She waited for the romantic hero. I waited for the partner. We both got the liar. I looked at the clock. It was 12:15. The delivery van would be pulling up to her curb right about now. The driver would be checking the clipboard. He would be reaching for that box of black roses. I imagined the scene. Elena's apartment was in a building with a doorman. Arthur paid for it. I found the bank transfers later. She would be buzzing the delivery boy up. She would be excited. After 6 months of white lilies, she probably thought Arthur's estate lawyers had finally found the secret letter he promised he'd leave. She probably thought this was the beginning of her new life. I picked up the diary again, holding it like a weapon. I had read it for 20 years. Well, not 20 years in real time, but I had devoured 20 years of her life in the last 6 months. I knew her better than her own mother did. I knew she was allergic to strawberries. I knew she was terrified of thunder. I knew she wanted to be a painter, but Arthur told her she was better as a muse. A muse, I scoffed. He turned a human being into an ornament. Suddenly, a wave of exhaustion hit me, so profound I almost laid my head down on the table. It wasn't just the grief. It was the weight of carrying the truth alone. Arthur was dead. He was safe in the ground, beyond reproach, eulogized as a saint. I was the only one left holding the bag of dirty laundry. Why should I carry it alone? Why should she get to keep her beautiful, tragic fantasy while I lived in the ugly reality? No, the black roses were necessary. The note was necessary. It wasn't cruelty. It was surgery. I was cutting out the rot. If I had to live with the knowledge that my marriage was a sham, she had to live with the knowledge that her affair was a farce. We were going to be equals in misery. Finally. The phone rang again. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird. I stared at the device on the wall. It was a jarring, mechanical scream in the quiet kitchen. Ring. It could be the florist calling back to say there was a problem. Ring. It could be a telemarketer. Ring. Or it could be her. I hadn't put my number on the card, of course, but women like Elena, they are resourceful when their hearts are broken. Or maybe she had called the florist. Maybe she had screamed at the poor girl until she gave up the name of the old woman who ordered the black funeral flowers. I stood up slowly, my knees popping. I smoothed down the front of my cardigan. I took a deep breath, smelling the stale air of the house, the scent of old paper and dead dreams. I reached out a hand that was spotted with age, but steady with purpose. I lifted the receiver. I said, my voice was raspy, like dry leaves scraping together. There was silence on the other end, not the silence of an empty line, but the breathing silence of a living person. I could hear a sharp intake of breath, a shuddering sound, like someone trying to keep their insides from spilling out. The voice was wet, broken, but undeniably elegant. It was the voice I had imagined reading the diary entries. I closed my eyes. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I felt a profound, aching sadness for both of us. I am the one who knows about the ring, I said softly into the receiver. The one with the ruby. I heard a gasp on the other end, a sound so sharp it sounded like glass shattering. He lied to you, my dear, I continued, my voice gaining a terrible strength, fueled by 20 years of silence. There was no Aunt Martha. And he never liked your coq au vin. I waited. The silence on the other end stretched, tight as a violin string about to snap. I gripped the phone, staring at the empty chair where Arthur used to sit. The unveiling had begun. I am 69 years old, an age when a woman is expected to be invisible, harmless, and fading gently into the wallpaper of her own life. Yet, for the last 6 months, I have been waging a quiet, devastating war by sending anonymous flowers to the woman my dead husband slept with. Yesterday, I sent the final arrangement, black roses, dark as a bruise, with a note that read, "He never loved you." Now, holding the phone receiver against my ear, I felt the reverberation of those words traveling through the wire, connecting my cold kitchen to her likely impeccable living room. The silence on the other end was not empty. It was thick, filled with the sudden, sharp intake of air that precedes a sob. I gripped the plastic handle of the phone until my knuckles turned white, matching the color of the rain-washed sky outside my window. My heart was beating an irregular, heavy rhythm against my ribs, a reminder of my own fragility. But my voice remained steady, anchored by decades of suppressed truth. "You are lying," the voice on the other end finally whispered. It was tremulous, wet with tears, yet holding on to a desperate thread of denial. "You are a cruel, sick person." Arthur loved me. He told me I was the only one who understood the darkness in his soul. I closed my eyes and leaned my forehead against the cool, painted plaster of the kitchen wall. The darkness in his soul. How many times had I heard that phrase? Arthur didn't have darkness in his soul. He had a fear of mediocrity and a talent for manipulation. "He told you that in October of 1998, I said softly, reciting the date from memory as if it were a scripture. We were sitting in the den. I was knitting a sweater for his nephew. He looked at me, sighed, and told me I was too simple to understand his complexities. Then he drove to your apartment and told you that you were his salvation." "But tell me, my dear, did he mention that he stopped at the liquor store on the way? Did he tell you he bought the cheap scotch because he was saving the good bottle for his poker night with the boys?" There was a gasp on the line, a sound like fabric tearing. "How do you know that?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch, cracking under the strain. "Who are you? Did he leave these things to you? Are you a lawyer?" "I am not a lawyer," I replied, and I looked down at the diary on the table. The leather cover was worn, the edges fraying. It smelled of her perfume, a scent that had haunted my laundry hamper for years, clinging to Arthur's collars like a ghost. I am the witness you never knew existed. I am the one who knows that you waited for him on Christmas Eve in 2001, wearing a green velvet dress, believing he was stuck in a snowstorm. I paused, letting the memory settle between us. He wasn't in a snowstorm, Alina. We were hosting a dinner party. He was laughing, he was drinking eggnog, and telling his boss a joke about a priest and a rabbi. He didn't come to you because he didn't want to leave the warmth of the fireplace. He called you from the garage while taking out the trash and told you the roads were closed. I watched him through the window. I saw him laugh as he hung up the phone. "Stop it!" she screamed. The sound distorted in the receiver, a jagged spike of pain. "Stop it! Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to ruin him for me? He's dead. He can't defend himself." "It is not him I am ruining," I said, and a strange wave of fatigue washed over me. I sank lower into the kitchen chair, feeling the wood press hard against my spine. My legs ached, a deep, throbbing ache that seemed to seep into the marrow. I am not ruining him. I am peeling away the paint. "You fell in love with a character, Alina, a role he played. You think you were the secret romance, the tragic heroine, but you were just the audience. And I was the stagehand who swept up the mess after the curtains closed." I could hear her weeping now, open and raw. It was a sound that should have given me satisfaction. This was the woman who had stolen hours, days, years of my husband's attention. This was the woman who had received the smiles I was denied. But listening to her break, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a heavy, suffocating kinship. We were two old women, tethered together by a man who hadn't deserved either of us. "He wrote me poems," she sobbed, her voice barely audible. "He wrote me beautiful poems on napkins." "He copied them from an anthology of British romantics we kept in the guest bathroom," I corrected her gently. "Volume 2, Lord Byron. He never wrote a line of poetry in his life. He couldn't even write a grocery list without spelling errors." The line went quiet again, save for her jagged breathing. I looked around my kitchen. It was spotless, sterile. The faucet dripped rhythmically, marking time. Drip, drip, drip. I saw the empty cup of tea, the cold liquid filming over. I saw the reflection of my own face in the dark window pane, gray hair, lines etched deep around the mouth, eyes that had seen too much and said too little. "I sent you the black roses not to be cruel," I said, my voice softening, losing its edge. "I sent them because you are mourning a man who never existed. You are wearing black for a phantom. I wanted you to know that the flowers, the white lilies you received for months, they weren't from him." Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. "They were for me," I confessed. "Why?" she whispered. The word was barely a breath. "Because I knew you were waiting," I said, looking at my trembling hands. "Because I knew how it felt to wait for him. I knew the specific agony of staring at the phone, of checking the window, of fixing your hair for a door that never opens. When he died, I found your address. I knew you wouldn't be at the funeral. He wouldn't have wanted a scene. So you were left alone in that apartment, with nothing. And as much as I hated you, God, as much as I hated you for 20 years, I couldn't bear the thought of another woman waiting for Arthur to show her kindness. So I sent the lilies. I let you believe he remembered you. Then why? Why stop? Why send the black ones? Why tell me this now?" "Because I am tired, Elena." I let out a breath that felt like it had been held in my chest since 1984. I am 69 years old. My joints hurt when it rains. My house is too big and too quiet. And I am tired of carrying his lies for him. He is gone. He is ash in a jar. He doesn't need us to protect his image anymore. I wanted you to know that you weren't the love of his life. And neither was I. We were just convenient. We were just places for him to rest. The cruelty of the truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I could feel her processing it, the way a body processes a shock, the denial, the anger, and finally, the crushing weight of reality. "Who are you?" she asked again, but this time the question wasn't defensive. It was a plea for context, for grounding. I took a deep breath. The smell of floor wax and stale tea filled my nose. I looked at the diary one last time, at the loops of her handwriting, so full of hope and delusion. "I am Clara," I said. The name landed between us like a stone dropped in a well. Clara, the wife, the obstacle, the nagging woman from the stories he told her. "Clara," she repeated, and then a sound I didn't expect, a short, hysterical laugh that turned into a sob. "You're the one with the bad hip? The one he said didn't like music?" I smiled, a thin, bitter curving of my lips. I was a dancer in my youth, Alina. I love jazz. And my hip only started hurting 5 years ago. He told you that to explain why he couldn't take you dancing. "Oh, God," she moaned. "Oh, God, Clara." We sat there in silence for a long time. Two widows connected by a telephone line and a dead man's deceit. The rain began to beat harder against the glass, blurring the world outside, turning the trees and the streetlights into gray, running smears. "I should hang up," I said finally. "The delivery man will be there soon. With the black roses." "Wait," she said quickly. Her voice was stronger now, stripped of the artifice, stripped of the romance. "Just wait. What do we do now?" "I don't know," I answered honestly. I looked at the empty kitchen, at the long afternoons stretching out before me. "I suppose we stop waiting." I lowered the phone slowly. I didn't slam it down. I placed it gently back into the cradle, severing the connection with a soft click. The kitchen was silent again, but the quality of the silence had changed. It wasn't the heavy, secretive silence of the last 20 years. It was empty, yes, but it was clean. The diary sat on the table, closed. The lies were out in the open, dissipating like smoke. I sat there for a moment, listening to the rain, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel the ghost of Arthur standing behind me. I was just Clara, alone, old, and surprisingly, finally, real. The silence that followed the click of the phone receiver was heavy, like a wet wool blanket draped over the entire kitchen. I stared at the device, half expecting it to jump off the wall and bite me, but it just sat there, plastic and mute. My heart was still doing that terrible, fluttering thing in my chest, a bird panic that made my fingertips tingle. I rubbed them against my apron, feeling the rough cotton weave, trying to remind myself that I was here, in my house, and the world hadn't actually ended just because I had finally spoken the truth. I walked to the sink to rinse my cup. The water was cold. It numbed my hands, which was good. It stopped the shaking. Through the window above the sink, the afternoon had dissolved into a prematurely dark, gray evening. The rain was relentless now, slashing against the glass, blurring the street into a watercolor painting of sorrow. I turned off the tap, and then I heard it. Not the phone, a car door slamming. It was a dull, heavy thud that cut through the rhythm of the rain. My house is set back from the road, and visitors are rare. The postman comes at 11, the gardener comes on Tuesdays. Today was Thursday. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, moving slowly, my hip giving a familiar twinge of protest. I walked down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my slippers, the same creak Arthur used to complain about, the one he promised to fix in 1995 and never did. I reached the front window and pulled the lace curtain back just an inch. A taxi was pulling away, its taillights bleeding red into the wet asphalt. And standing at the end of my walkway, looking up at the house like a pilgrim reaching a cathedral that had been bombed out, was a woman. She wasn't wearing a coat, just a beige trench that looked thin and soaked through. She had no umbrella. The rain plastered her blonde hair. Died, I knew from the diary. She touched up her roots every 3 weeks to her skull. She looked smaller than I expected. In my head, she had been a giantess, a siren, a force of nature that stole husbands. Standing there in the downpour, shivering, clutching her purse to her chest, she looked like a lost dog. Elena, she shouldn't know where I lived. But then, I shouldn't know about her strawberry allergy. When you spend 20 years obsessing over a ghost, you learn the geography of the haunting. She must have looked us up years ago. She must have driven past this house 100 times, wondering what kind of prison Arthur was trapped in. I should have locked the door. I should have turned off the porch light and gone upstairs to bed. I was 69 years old. I didn't have the energy for a brawl. But my feet moved on their own, driven by a curiosity that was stronger than my fear. I wanted to see her, not the words on the page, not the phantom in my head. I wanted to see the flesh and bone reality. I opened the front door. The wind blew a spray of cold rain into the entryway, dampening the hem of my skirt. She jumped when the latch clicked, her eyes snapping up to meet mine. They were blue. Arthur had always loved blue eyes. Mine are brown, like mud, he used to say teasingly. Like rich earth, I used to tell myself. We stared at each other across 10 yards of wet concrete and 20 years of lies. You! She shouted over the sound of the rain. Her voice was thin, snatched away by the wind. Come inside, I said. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. I wasn't going to have the neighbors watching us shout like fishwives in the storm. She hesitated, looking at the door as if it were the mouth of a beast. Then, shivering violently, she walked up the path. Her heels clicked unevenly on the stone. The irony was sharp enough to cut skin. I stepped back, and she crossed the threshold. The smell hit me instantly. Beneath the scent of wet fabric and rain, there was the perfume. Gardenias. It was the smell that had lingered on Arthur's suit jackets. The smell I had convinced myself was just a new type of dry cleaning solvent for the first year, until I knew better. Smelling it now in my own hallway made my stomach turn over. She stood there, water pooling around her expensive shoes, shaking uncontrollably. Up close, the tragedy was etched into her face. The mascara had run into the creases around her eyes. Her lipstick had bled into the fine lines of her mouth. She was old, just like me. Her neck was loose. Her hands, clutching that purse, were veiny and spotted. Arthur's tragic muse was just a wet, frightened pensioner. "You're Clara," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "I am," I said. I didn't offer to take her coat. I didn't offer her tea. This wasn't a social call. She looked around the hallway, her eyes darting frantically. She looked at the wallpaper, yellow flowers, slightly faded. She looked at the grandfather clock ticking slowly in the corner. She looked at the framed photo of Arthur and me on our 40th anniversary, hanging above the telephone table. In the photo, Arthur was smiling, that tight, practiced smile. I was looking at the camera with the dead eyes of a woman who knows her husband is thinking about someone else. "He told me," she started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "He told me he lived in a mausoleum. He said it was dark. He said you kept the curtains drawn and the house was always cold." I reached out and adjusted the thermostat on the wall, turning the heat up a degree. "Arthur was cold because his blood was thin," I said flatly. "The house has southern exposure. It's always full of light." She let out a small, strangled sound. She walked past me, uninvited, into the living room. I followed her. I watched her take in the room, the comfortable armchairs, the stack of magazines on the coffee table, the half-finished puzzle of a lighthouse on the card table in the corner. "It's just a house," she said, sounding devastated. "It's just a normal house." "What did you expect?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe, feeling the exhaustion pulling at my muscles. Chains on the walls? A dungeon where I kept him prisoner? "He said he was trapped," she said, turning to face me. The anger was rising in her voice again, a defense mechanism against the pain. "He said he stayed out of duty. He said you were ill, fragile, that leaving you would kill you." I let out a dry, barking laugh. It hurt my throat. I haven't been to a doctor for anything other than a checkup in 10 years. Arthur was on 3 different medications for his blood pressure and his cholesterol. I was the one who sorted his pills every Sunday night. She slumped. It was as if her strings had been cut. She sank down onto the sofa, my sofa, the one I had reupholstered last year, and buried her face in her hands. She was weeping, ugly, gasping sobs that shook her thin shoulders. I watched her for a long time. I should have hated her. This was the woman who had taken the best of him. She had taken the laughter, the romance, the working late nights. She had been the destination of every lie he ever told me. But looking at her, a wet, broken heap on my floral cushions, I couldn't find the hate. It had evaporated, leaving behind a vast, gray pity. She hadn't stolen anything valuable. She had stolen a liar. And she had paid for it with her life, waiting in an apartment for phone calls that only came when he was bored. I walked over to the armchair, Arthur's chair, and sat down. The leather sighed under my weight. "He lied to us both, Elena," I said softly. She looked up, her face a ruin of makeup and tears. "But he loved me," she insisted, though her voice was weak. "The letters, the flowers." "The flowers were me," I reminded her. "And the letters?" I gestured toward the kitchen, where the diary still lay on the table. "I read your diary, Elena. I know what he wrote to you. He wrote the same things to me in 1974. It was a script. He was a very lazy writer." "No," she moaned, rocking back and forth. "No, no." "Yes." I leaned forward, my voice hard but not cruel. "Did you know he had a third one?" The sobbing stopped abruptly. The room went dead silent, save for the rain lashing the windows. Elena stared at me, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. "What?" she whispered. "A third one," I repeated. "A dental hygienist named Sarah, 1990 to 1993, before he met you." Elena looked like I had slapped her. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "I found the receipts in his glove compartment," I continued, the memory tasting like ash in my mouth. "Tiffany bracelets, hotel rooms in the city. He told me he was going to conferences. He told her, I assume, that his wife didn't understand him, just like he told you. He swore I was the first," Elena stammered. "He swore he had never strayed before. He said it was fate, that he couldn't help it because our connection was cosmic." "Cosmic?" I scoffed. "It wasn't cosmic. It was pathetic." "He needed constant adoration, Elena. I was busy raising his children and running his house. I stopped looking at him like he was a god, so he went out to find someone who would. He found Sarah. Then she got too demanding, wanted him to leave me. So he found you. You were quieter. You asked for less." "I didn't ask for less," she cried, a flash of her old defiance returning. "I asked for everything. I waited 20 years for him to leave you." "And he never did he?" I asked. She fell silent. The truth hung between us, undeniable. "He never left," I said, leaning back into the leather chair that still smelled faintly of his tobacco, because he didn't want to leave. He had the perfect life. He had a wife to wash his clothes and cook his meals, and he had a mistress to stroke his ego and make him feel young. Why would he ruin that? He was comfortable. Elena stared at the floor. The fight had gone out of her. She looked at the mud she had tracked in on the carpet. "I wasted my life," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. We sat there in silence for a long time. The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour. Dong. A single, mournful note. I looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't the enemy. She was just another casualty. We were two old women sitting in a room that was slowly getting dark, mourning a man who hadn't been worth a single tear from either of us. I stood up. My knees popped loudly in the quiet room. "I'm going to make tea," I said. "Earl Grey. It's what he drank, but I always hated it. I prefer chamomile." I walked to the kitchen doorway, then stopped and looked back at her. "You take yours with lemon," I said. "I know. I read it in the entry from June 12th, 2004. Elena looked up at me. There was no anger in her eyes anymore, just a terrible, hollow exhaustion. "Yes," she said softly, "with lemon." I nodded and went into the kitchen. I filled the kettle. My hands were steady now. The house felt different. The ghost was gone. It was just us now, the survivors. The kettle began to whistle, a low, rising shriek that seemed to mimic the tension in my own head. I snatched it off the burner before it could reach its full, piercing crescendo, my hand wrapping around the hot handle. I poured the water into the two mugs, my chipped floral one and the fine bone china guest cup I hadn't used since Arthur's funeral. The steam rose up, curling around my face, damp and warm. I watched the tea bags bleed their color into the water. Dark amber for the Earl Grey, pale gold for my chamomile. I placed the mugs on a tray, adding a saucer with 3 digestive biscuits, Arthur's favorites, the ones he used to dunk until they were soggy and gross. It was a habit, buying them. I realized, looking at the packet, that I hated digestive biscuits. I had always hated them. They tasted like cardboard and dust. Walking back into the living room required an effort of will that made my knees ache. I was carrying tea to the woman who had helped destroy my marriage, and yet, looking at her huddled on my sofa, I felt less like a vengeful wife and more like a nurse attending to a terminal patient. "Here," I said, setting the tray down on the coffee table. I pushed the china cup toward her. I didn't have fresh lemon. "You'll have to take it black." Elena looked at the tea as if it were a magic potion that might poison or cure her. Her hands, when she reached for the cup, were shaking so badly the liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the white saucer brown. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was ravaged, scratchy from the crying. She took a sip, flinching at the heat. "It tastes bitter." "He liked it that way," I said, sitting back in my chair and wrapping my hands around my own mug for warmth. "He liked things that tasted like they were punishing him." She looked at me over the rim of the cup. Her blue eyes were bloodshot, the eyelids puffy and swollen. Without the armor of her vanity, she looked her age. She looked 65, maybe older. "Did you love him?" she asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, breathless and desperate. I looked at the window, where the rain was still streaming down in rivulets, distorting the street lamp outside into a blur of orange light. "I did," I said, "for a long time. I loved the version of him I thought I had, the man who danced with me at our wedding, the man who held our daughter when she was born. But that man died a long time ago, Elena. long before he actually stopped breathing. The man you knew, the one who snuck around and lied and bought you trinkets to assuage his guilt? No, I didn't love him. I managed him. She set the cup down with a clatter. It sounds so cold when you say it. Survival is cold, I replied. You kept yourself warm with fantasies. I had to live in the real world. I had to pay the bills he forgot about. I had to apologize to the neighbors when he got drunk and loud. I had to wash his clothes and smell you on them. She flinched, shrinking back into the cushions. I didn't know, she whispered. I mean, I knew you existed. But he made you sound invisible, like a piece of furniture. I smiled, but there was no humor in it. That is the luxury of the mistress, Elena. You get the romance. The wife gets the laundry. We sat in the heavy silence again, the clock ticking away the seconds of our wasted lives. And then the doorbell rang. The sound was jarring, an intrusion from a world we had both forgotten existed. Elena jumped, spilling more tea. I stared at the door. I knew who it was. I had scheduled it yesterday, in a fit of rage, wanting to twist the knife one last time. I stood up. My legs felt heavy, like lead. Who is that? Elena asked, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. I walked to the door without answering. I opened it to find a young man standing there, soaking wet, holding a long, rectangular box wrapped in elegant black paper. He looked miserable. Delivery for Miss Elena? He squinted at the clipboard, then at me. But the address is here. I signed the electronic pad with a finger that didn't tremble. Thank you, I said. I took the box. It was light, but it felt heavy with implication. I closed the door, shutting out the rain and the young man who had no idea he was delivering a tombstone. I walked back into the living room and placed the black box on the coffee table, right next to the tea and the digestive biscuits. What is that? Elena asked, her eyes widening. I sat down and looked at her. Open it. She stared at the box. She knew. I could see the realization dawning on her face, the horror of it. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and pulled the black ribbon. It gave way easily. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in black tissue paper, were 12 roses, deep, velvety black roses. They were beautiful in a grotesque, mournful way, and in the center, a small white card. She didn't pick up the card. She just stared at the flowers, her chest heaving. Read the note, Elena, I said softly. She shook her head. I can't. Read it. She reached into the box, avoiding the thorns, and picked up the card. She held it close to her face, squinting in the dim light of the lamp. I knew what it said. I had written it in my mind 1,000 times before I typed it into the florist's website. He never loved you. I know because I read your diary for 20 years. She read it silently, her lips moving slightly. Then she let out a sound, half laugh, half sob, a terrible, broken sound that seemed to crack the room in two. She dropped the card onto the table. It landed face up. You're cruel, Clara, she whispered, looking at me. Yes, I agreed. I am, but I'm also right. She looked back at the roses. They looked like holes in the universe, absorbing the light. He didn't love anyone, she said, her voice gaining a sudden, surprising strength. Not you, not me, not Sarah. He only loved how we made him feel. I nodded slowly. The knot in my chest, the one that had been there for 20 years, began to loosen. Finally, she understood. He was a vampire, I said. He drank our youth and our hope, and he left us empty. Elena reached out and touched the petal of one of the black roses. It was a gentle touch, almost affectionate. "We wasted so much time," she said. "I waited for him every Christmas, every birthday. I sat by the phone. I didn't marry. I didn't have children. I just waited." "And I waited for him to come home," I said. "I waited for him to notice me again. I waited for him to change." We looked at each other, really looked at each other, across the ruins of our shared history. The anger was gone. The jealousy was gone. There was only grief. Grief for the years we couldn't get back. Grief for the love we had poured into a bottomless pit. Elena stood up. She smoothed her trench coat, buttoning it with clumsy fingers. She picked up her purse. "I should go," she said. I didn't stop her. There was nothing left to say. The truth was on the table, surrounded by black petals. She walked to the door, and I followed her. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. The air coming through the open door was cold and clean, smelling of wet earth and autumn. She turned to me on the porch. She looked frail, but her eyes were dry now. "What will you do with the diary?" she asked. I thought about the leather-bound book sitting on my kitchen table, the book that contained her soul, her delusions, her pain. "I'm going to burn it," I said, "in the fireplace, tonight." She nodded. "Good. Burn it all." She hesitated, then reached out and awkwardly patted my arm. Her hand was cold. "Goodbye, Clara." "Goodbye, Elena." She turned and walked down the path, her heels clicking on the wet stones. She didn't look back at the house. She didn't look back at the window where she used to imagine her lover was trapped. She just walked away, a small figure disappearing into the gray evening mist. I watched her until she turned the corner and was gone. Then I stepped back inside and closed the door. I locked it. The heavy thud of the deadbolt echoed in the hallway. I walked back into the living room. The black roses sat on the table, ominous and dark. I picked up the box. I carried it to the trash can in the kitchen and dumped it in. Flowers, box, note, and all. I didn't feel a thing. Then I picked up the diary. I held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. 20 years of longing. 20 years of lies. I walked to the fireplace in the living room. I struck a match. The flame flared up, bright and yellow. I held it to the corner of the pages. The paper caught quickly, curling and blackening. I threw the book onto the grate and watched the flames lick up the spine. The leather hissed as it burned. I sat in Arthur's chair, no, my chair, and watched the fire. I watched until the words turned to ash. I watched until the handwriting was destroyed. I watched until there was nothing left but gray dust and the glowing embers of a warmth that was finally, truly mine. The house was quiet, but for the first time in decades, it wasn't empty. I was there, and that was enough.